Hello fellow YouTubers, and welcome to the first and maybe the last reading my first self-published novel, Aggravation. I made a promise that I would do this video, so please sit down, put your feet up, relax, sip your favourite brew, close your eyes if you will. I will start from the very beginning, the introduction, and read about 10 or 15 pages. Here we go. No, not at all. I'd enjoy the company, so please, make yourself comfortable. It is a glorious day, absolutely glorious. Wouldn't be dead for all the tea in China on a day like this. Yes, you're right. It is good to feel the sun on your face after all the inclement weather we've had of late. Don't mind the rain myself. Saves me having to water my garden. You too? Yes, I think all gardeners would feel the same way. And look what the rain has done to everything about us. Why, I haven't seen the grass so lush for ages. And the new growth in all the plants, shrubs and trees, is nothing short of miraculous. A resurrection. Yes, that's true. It does make for a lot of extra work for the keepers of the park, but it's a small price to pay for all the good the rain does. That much? Really? I had no idea. Never considered keeping a rain gauge myself. No, I might do just that. Do you come here often, by the way? No? Oh, such a shame. So peaceful. I enjoy the quiet times here. There was a time not too long ago when this was truly a tranquil place, until the powers that be decided to build a 6-lane city bypass. Resumed a sizable portion of the park and its gardens, all in the name of progress. Pity that. I hope you don't mind me talking to you. No? Good. Sometimes it does the world of good to share one's thoughts with a sympathetic ear. Good for the soul. I agree. It does seem like many have lost the ability to talk these days, and the ability to listen too, which can be a tad aggravating at times. May I ask what aggravates you? Ah, yes, and such a dangerous habit too. I always slow down and hope they get the message. Most do, don't they? Yes, that's true. There's always one who has to push it. But then that's true with everything in life. Always has to be the minority who never get the message. Never, ever. Me? I detest noise. Absolutely despise it. A pox on society, noise is. Anywhere and everywhere. We just can't escape it. Do you feel the same, by chance? Good point. It does depend on the noise, yes. But we shouldn't confuse noise with sounds. Sounds are commonplace and ordinary. Listen to the laughter of that child over there on the swing. That's a pleasant sound, isn't it? The birds and their songs. Doesn't hurt the ears at all. Does it? No. No, sounds are totally alien to noise. Sounds are everyday and usual. Yes, I agree. They do make a noise, but at least a lawnmower, and indeed a line trimmer, chainsaw and so on, have a useful purpose. And once that purpose is fulfilled, the noise stops. But not so with one particular noise. The be-all and end-all of all noise on the face of the planet, as far as I and a good many others are concerned. As a matter of fact, I can hear it now. Can you? No? Just listen, my friend, and I guarantee you'll pick it up. In fact, I wouldn't mind betting that you're more than familiar with it. Aha, yes. I can tell by the look on your face that you can now hear and know exactly what I'm talking about. Obscene, don't you think? That's a thumper making that noise. Yes, I thought so too. Most appropriate. I liked the word the very moment I saw it. Have you ever tried to reason with a thumper? I thought so. They just won't listen. Arrogance personified. Don't give a fuck about anyone but themselves. Sorry about the expletive. Did I offend you? No? Good. Very good. I find crude language so useful at times. A no-nonsense way of letting the listener know exactly how you feel about a particular something. We do. Yes, we do. Hear that particular four-letter word all too often these days. Still, it all depends on how it's said and who says it. Sometimes that particular word can make us laugh, and sometimes we take immediate offence to it. A time and a place for the use of the word, don't you think? I agree wholeheartedly. Too bad that noise doesn't remain in its place, and I think we'd all breathe a welcome sigh of relief. Yet it doesn't matter what time of the day or night as far as the thump is concerned. No, doesn't matter at all. Yes, that's what it's called. Techno music. I didn't know that. Nothing music about it, though, is there? Makes me want to bash my head against the nearest wall. You too, eh? Well, I'm not surprised. Wouldn't surprise me in the least if most felt the same way. Exactly. That's the biggest problem with it, isn't it? It just goes on and on and on. If it wasn't so persistent, we might be able to tolerate it. But there's no consideration, is there? No. How true. We do indeed live closer together in today's society than ever before, and we're far less tolerant because of it, which only goes to prove what a mindless aberration a thumper is. That's right, yes. Doesn't matter where you go these days, there's always a thumper nearby. And every street has at least one, don't they? I'm glad you mentioned that. I thought I might have been the only one who felt that way. I stay well clear of those shops that make a habit of playing that thumping noise. Don't know what possesses them to do it in the first place. Not conducive to good customer relations, as far as I'm concerned. I suppose you're right. Youth of today expect that sort of atmosphere in the shops they like to frequent. Don't know any better, do they? Completely normal to their way of thinking. It is a habit, isn't it? An addiction to noise is what it is. The louder the better. That's for sure. Hear it coming from a mile away. So loud at times that it rattles the windows. Why, we must be, what, 400 metres from the highway and still we can hear it? You noticed that too, did you? Just proves how arrogant a thumper is. Wind down all the windows and let it rip. Think it's a real hoot, don't they? I wonder about that myself. Where does the money come from? I guess it must be the dole. Live five-star lifestyles while making a career of being unemployed and indulging in antisocial behaviour. Couldn't agree with you more. In fact, from my experience, it seems parents encourage their children to be obnoxious from an early age. Next door, you say? Oh my. I am sorry to hear that. Must drive you to distraction. The constant bop, bop, bop of a tennis ball is bad enough. I know, but the ping, ping, ping of a basketball. Still, it's funny that you should mention that particular type of aggravation, because I'm reading a story where the main character is subjected to that very noise. That and other noises too, including the noise of a thumper. You'll enjoy it, I'm sure. Aggravation is the title of the book. Yes, I thought so too. An apt title. A very apt title indeed, as a matter of fact. 8 months ago, on a Saturday afternoon in April, at precisely 3:08 p.m, while seated at the kitchen table partaking of afternoon tea, at the exact moment he raised a dunked Arnott's ginger nut biscuit to his mouth, Clyde Fillimore had an epiphany. An awakening is what it was, and a rude awakening at that, to how quickly his life was passing by, and to how rapidly his own mortality was approaching the inevitability of his demise, death, the final humiliation. Clyde wasn't afraid of death, because death was instantaneous, but dying wasn't. Dying was slow and usually painful, and Clyde, if death didn't claim him in an instant, didn't want to suffer being surrounded by noise. No, Clyde wanted to suffer in peace and solitude, and during the interim, that period before the pain and suffering, he wanted to live in peace and solitude as well. It wasn't the first time that Clyde had been goaded into action because of a revelation, but it was the first time, and probably the last, that he'd be compelled to look for a change in his geography. He'd always been happy living in Glebe, New South Wales, but times had changed and Clyde didn't like what was happening with those changes. Hadn't liked it for years, in fact. Too many people living too close together and making too much noise all too often. Always too much noise. So much noise that it was a wonder Clyde hadn't had the epiphany much sooner. He could put up with the usual noises associated with day-to-day life. After all, he made those noises himself when he had to, and thought nothing of it when he did. But it was the other noises, well, one particular noise, that he couldn't abide, that had become all too frequent, all too often, by far too many. The noise of those addicted to the thump. Thump, 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 thump. Thump in the morning, thump in the afternoon, thump in the evening, thump all through the night. Always that incessant thump. So in less than 15 minutes following the epiphany, Clyde was sitting behind the wheel of his car, driving. But to where, he didn't have a clue. Being single, he was able to do that without the need for the whys and wherefores demanded by a spouse. And being a self-published author who sold his work via his own personal website, he was virtually answerable to only one person, himself. So after packing a few clothes and toiletries, securing the house, he had simply reversed his car from the driveway and allowed the turn of the steering wheel to dictate in which direction he would go, which had turned out to be southeast. Perhaps it was serendipitous. The electrician's van was double parked close to the left side of the concrete apron leading to his driveway, and he had found it easier to turn the steering wheel hard left and scribe an arc round the front of the van. And maybe it was fate too, that a semi-trailer had happened to be slowly turning from Glebe Point Road onto Broadway. At the same time he had a green arrow to turn right from Glebe Point Road onto Broadway. Otherwise he may have turned left and headed east rather than west. West along Parramatta Road until entering the Western Freeway at Homebush, then onto all points west to the Blue Mountains and beyond. He had stopped in Lithgow for petrol and a meal, taking his time over the repast. Then he continued along the Western Highway for several kilometres, until a whim had encouraged him to exit left and continue on toward Mudgee. By the time he had arrived in Mudgee, the sun was low on the western horizon, so he decided to seek motel accommodation for the night and continue anew with his odyssey the next day. Early next morning at around 8 o'clock, he had been standing in a small queue of 4 in the motel reception area waiting to settle his account, and wishing he had the foresight to pay for his room in advance. Besides the thumping noise, there was a particular type of music Clyde couldn't stand a bar of. Country and western. And that's what had been assaulting his oral cavities as he had waited. And as he had waited, he had thought that it didn't matter where you went, you just couldn't escape the aggravations of this modern world. And perhaps he was naive to think he could escape the curse, for that's what it was, of modern society. He had been wasting his time in doing so. But 10 minutes later, sitting behind the wheel of his car, he had decided to let his other self dictate what he would do. If, upon reaching the crossroad, his other self had urged him to turn left and head to whence he had came yesterday, so be it. He would return home. But if he was urged to turn right, then so be it too. He would continue on to whatever he was destined to be. A little less than 2 hours later, after driving 131 kilometres, Clyde had reset the trip meter, almost due north, had parked his car on the shoulder of the road, the engine idling, looking at a sign. Welcome, a friendly town, a tidy town, population 2,201, and thinking, what a funny name for a town. Nevertheless, Clyde spent a week in the town just to get a feel for the place, staying in a quaint bed and breakfast called Welcome Inn, located at the far eastern end of town, in a leafy tree-lined street, Elm Street, where none of the residents resembled Freddy Krueger, and no one had a penchant for thrusting their musical preferences down their neighbours' throats. The proprietors of Welcome Inn, Stan and Florence Newman, were an older couple who reminded Clyde of Ma and Pa Kettle, but fortunately that's where the likeness had ended. Their children had long since grown up and were no longer in residence, and the family home that had once resonated with the sounds and noises, all too common with children, was now as quiet could be, and Clyde had liked that. They'd also liked the use of the preposition in, as opposed to the noun in, even though the two words weren't connected and had totally different meanings. There was a term for it, but he hadn't been able to remember what it was. 8 months on, and he still couldn't remember what the term was. And he liked the way in which the Newmans had run their establishment, efficiently, without asking too many questions. Nosy Parkers and sticky beaks didn't have a place in Clyde's life. But above all, he liked their cleanliness. Clyde was a stickler when it came to cleanliness. Cleanliness was next to godliness, his mother had been fond of saying. One of only a handful of things Clyde had ever been in agreement with her. She had been a domineering woman who rarely gave his father a moment's peace when he was at home. If it wasn't one thing that bothered her, it was something else. Always going on, Arthur this, Arthur that, and Arthur, why don't you ever listen to me? You know I work my fingers to the bone, keeping this house spick and span, but what's the point when you don't mow the lawn? When the grass is a mess, the house feels the same way to me. Surely you know that by now. And don't tell me you work hard too, because no work is harder than housework. You mark my words. Such an aggravating woman, Clyde had thought. Then it is dismissed those thoughts, not wanting to dwell on the past, that he found a habit of invading his mind if he let it. It was hard at times to do that, but at that particular time he had plenty to occupy his mind with, and he found it easy to relegate those thoughts of a time when to where they rightfully belonged, in the darkness recess of his unconscious mind, the id. Clyde had decided on Sunday that he would simply pay a visit to and browse the display windows of the 2 real estate agents and the 1 stock and station agent he had found listed in the local phone book, jotting down the addresses of houses for sale in the town itself, as well as small rural properties for sale within a 20-kilometre radius. He wasn't particularly interested in acreage, but if by chance a pleasant rustic domicile on a few acres had caught his eye, he had thought he might give due consideration. He was well aware that there would be other listings inside the three establishments, but it was reasonable to expect that the best of the best would be on display, and he had wanted to make the most of his time free of the encumbrances of a second party, and would only involve a particular agent if he found something he was interested enough to warrant an inspection, or wasn't satisfied with what he had seen the result of his window shopping. On the morning of the second day, Monday, Clyde had jotted down 16 addresses acquired from the windows of the three agents, and after a brief visit to the Tourist Information Centre located in the foyer of Council City Chambers on the corner of Castle and Lister Streets for a street map, he had bought a soft drink and returned to his car to familiarise himself with the layout of the town. Parked as he had been in the Main Street virtue of the geographical centre of the town, he had been able to observe what was going on about him in between perusing the map and a brief history of the town. To his right and directly opposite, across the street, on the corner of Castle and Bank Streets, was a motel, the Sundowner. Clyde was familiar with the term sundowner, referring to the drovers who set up camp at sundown following another day in the saddle, as they drove flocks of sheep and herds of cattle across the vast expanses of the Australian outback to a distant market, or in the search of feed at times of drought. It wasn't particularly pleasing to Clyde's eyes, not in the least, and he had wondered if the dirty brick veneer and the equally dirty concrete block retaining wall that were directly opposite reception would deter weary travellers from seeking accommodation. It would him. Further on down Bank Street, he had noticed on the map was a public swimming pool and park, Bishop Park, and the next street past the park was Baker Street, prompting Clyde to instantly think of Sherlock Holmes. Clyde had been an avid reader almost all of his life, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and H.G. Wells were two of his favourite authors. He had also thought how strange it would be if the house in Baker Street for sale would be exactly what he was looking for the idea of living in Baker Street really appealed to him. He would know as soon as he set eyes on it if the house was right for him, and if it wasn't, he wasn't about to buy just for the sake of a street name, no matter how much the idea excited him. And it did. A block past Baker Street, Bank Street ended at a T intersection with North Street. But except for North Street being north of the town centre, it ran east-west, which Clyde had thought didn't make sense. But when he had consulted the map again, he had noticed that South Street to the south also ran east-west. So it then made perfect sense to Clyde why the two streets were so named. He had wondered why it had seemed strange to him to begin with. Low blood sugar perhaps? Or maybe it was because he was just getting old and had simply had a brief moment of confusion. On the corner across the street from the Sundowner Motel stood a pub, the Memorial, and again Clyde wasn't impressed with the exterior facade, a mixture of dull brown and white glazed tiles girthing the lower half of the building, and a panoramic pro-half style painting depicting the Australian outback covering the top half of the building. Clyde had thought at the time that he would never become accustomed to that painting ever. It was just too tawdry and too hard on his eyes. He wouldn't have been impressed with the interior either, because what was on the top half of the building on the outside was also on the top half of all the walls on the inside. Not that Clyde would ever know that. Clyde didn't drink, never had. But other than that, he didn't like the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke, both of which were all too obvious to Clyde's nose as a pedestrian on the outside passing by, so he could well imagine what the stench might be on the inside. He hadn't been surprised to notice that at 10:15 in the morning, the pub had a steady flow of patrons. Obviously the regulars had nothing better to do with their time. Their home away from home, Clyde had thought. Still, nothing unusual about that in a country where drinking beer was a way of life, and those who didn't drink were looked upon with wary eyes. But apart from the motel and the pub, all the facades of the shops that occupied the north side of Castle Street, although far from award winners, were befitting the rustic ambience that one would expect from a town dating back to 1858. In fact, Clyde wouldn't have been surprised that except for signage, a coat of paint or two, and the awnings, many of those shops have been standing since the latter part of the 19th century, and he liked that. And he also liked too what he was able to see from his position, the exterior of the pub that occupied the corner of Castle and Link Streets at the far western end of the north side. The commercial, like the Sundowner, indeed, like all the structures, was double-storey. But other than that, the two had nothing in common with each other. The commercial had style, a combination of Georgian and colonial architecture that reminded Clyde of, although not as grand, Juniper Hall in Oxford Street, Paddington. The wooden columns that support the overhead balcony, the wooden fretwork of the balcony balustrade and fretwork of the wooden friezes and corners, the brickwork and wooden window shutters were Georgian through and through, while the large wood-frame sash-type windows top and bottom, and the corrugated iron roof of the building and bull nose of the front veranda were colonial, rural Australia to a T, and the two styles complemented each other. The commercial, according to the history on the map, was the first wooden structure to be built when Welcome was in its infancy, at the beginning of the gold rush era in 1858. And since that time to the present, the pub exchanged ownership but 4 times. That little snippet of information hadn't surprised Clyde in the least. His deceased uncle had inherited the family's property from his father, who had inherited it from his, so it made for sound business practice to hand over the reins and keep the pub in the family for long as was inheritably possible. Clyde had inherited the family home from his father, but the house had originally been owned by his maternal grandmother, who had passed it on to his mother when she passed away. His parents had always rented before his mother's inheritance, so it made for a pleasant change to live in a house that his mother was finally able to once again call home. A home where his mother had been raised at a time when the basic wage was £4, 10 shillings a week, and the cost of a house represented 20 years' wages, and by today's standards probably still would. Whew. It's hard to read. It really is. I made a few bloopers, a few mistakes, but I expected nothing less. Maybe it puts you off a bit, I don't know. But I'll call it quits now. I want to thank you for watching and listening, or maybe just for listening. If you liked the first reading, please comment and encourage me to continue on. If I don't hear from anyone, I'll assume that no one's interested, and that'll be it. The first episode will be the last episode, as I said at the beginning. So, until next time, if there is a next time, bye for now.